Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jeff Richard and we talked about the process of balancing the history and source material of Glorantha and RuneQuest with creating new content for the game and the world. It's a complicated balancing act, and I asked Jeff to explain it in this interview, which I'm about to jump across to. Beforehand, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium channel. It helps us out and it lets us make more content like this. Thanks.
Well, I tend to view what I'm writing on with Glorantha and RuneQuest as kind of an ongoing conversation, an ongoing writing project that I'd been working on with Greg since the 90s. Now, Greg has passed on now, but Greg wrote a tremendous amount of material going back to the late 1960s. And usually when I'm working on anything, I start with, well, what did Greg write about this? Or what did Greg and I talk about this when I was working on the guide or elsewhere? And start with that as the framework. And then I more than in any of the previous periods of Gloranthan publishing, I'm really trying to make sure that everything fits together in a cohesive whole so that our characters can go from Dragon Pass and eventually go to the southern continent of Pameltella or out to Krallarella or out to the far west. And so and when Greg was writing a lot of this, a lot of those areas were things that he had really fragmentary ideas about, and often, and which is normal in the creative process, very self-contradictory ideas about that, and so a lot of what I'm doing is trying to figure out well, how should all of this fit together, and then to what extent is the legacy material, does that help push together in the overall setting? And to what extent is there legacy material that just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb? And you're right, it's a balancing act.
So I totally get it's a balancing act, and I hear that it's a collaborative process. I immediately want to hear about the extremes. Can you talk first of all about circumstances in which you have nothing of Greg's to fall back on? It's a complete.
Oh, well, I wrote the guide, so I wrote the guide to Glorantha, and I would say, I don't know, two-thirds of it was stuff I had to work. Now, Greg gave us an incredible framework and to work off, but still, there were large areas that I pretty much had to create out of whole cloth. Rallios was an area there wasn't a whole lot on. Much of the Lunar Empire, we had to create. Most of Frenella, we had to create. There were things there, and there was a good skeleton, and in some areas there was a lot of detail, but in other areas it was, well, let's try to make it up.
Oh, for sure. I mean, what I was specifically interested in is how is your creative process as a writer, as a publisher, as a creator different when you were doing something that you were creating from scratch rather than something where you want to be going back and pulling from established content?
That's actually a good question, because if I'm looking at the last few books that I've been working on, they both of those issues have been threaded together. So if we start with the Cults of Glorantha or with the Sartor book, there are things in there, many of the cults and gods. Hey, here's some stuff, elements that Greg did, full write-ups that have existed before, and then here are areas that are all brand new, or the extent to which I had anything to work on is Greg had a name that name appeared in one or two stories. Now let's build that out into something that is playable. And so as a writer, I'm used to both of those things being, or both of those threads being, things that I always have to carry. In one hand, I've got the material that Greg, or often it's Sandy or Ken Rolston or Janelle Jackways or any of the other Steve Perrin, any of the other people that have contributed to Glorantha over the years. And in the other hand, I've got the material that I have to create. And sometimes it means, hey, I've got this material that somebody else made. It doesn't fit together that well. Let's just put that down and weave something new into it.
So I'm going to dive in a little deeper into that because I think it's super interesting. And obviously the RuneQuest Gloranthan writing process and collaborative process, I think has been very effective and have really created a great world. And having been someone who's written a bit of RuneQuest stuff myself, I had a great time writing in it and collaborating with everybody. But I'm interested in, are there specific circumstances in which you have found the established material to be a bit restrictive and that you've had to make large changes? Now, I know this is a very loaded question, but I'm interested in your perspective on it.
Yeah, I don't think it's not so much, well, yeah, in some areas it was because it was restrictive. In other areas, I don't think that it was very well thought through. You got to, the way I view it is Glorantha went through several waves of heavy writing. Let's start with the first wave, which was Greg was writing not for a game setting. He was writing short stories and engaging in pure world creation. And so most of this stuff was set in what is now the Gloranthan West, but it was also Krallarella and Pameltella come out of all of that. And a lot of the mythic structure of the setting comes from that, as well as these stories of this hero Argrat fighting against Gabaji. And I say Argrat because Greg then went back to that period and decided about 10 years later, hey, that board game that I've made, White Bull and Red Moon, let's set it in my Glorantha setting. And so he basically took this area, Dragon Pass in the Lunar Empire, and he shoved that into his setting, and they mixed together. And even then, from the very beginning, there were things that was in that early setting, early material that Greg just threw out because it didn't fit as well in, or he was dissatisfied with it. Then we get into the RuneQuest period, where Greg was just on a tear. He was engaged in what I think is probably one of the most amazing sustained periods of world creation. Not only in gaming, but I think actually in fantasy fiction altogether. And then Chaosium licensed out RuneQuest to Avalon Hill. Greg realized that he actually lost money. Chaosium was losing money for everything, all the time that he would be spending on Glorantha and RuneQuest. And so Greg was less involved in anything for RuneQuest and started playing around with fictional stories. I'm saying this all in waves because you can, Greg kept revisiting his material. And when he started writing his fictional material, he went with a different time period. He ignored a lot of the earlier writings on the grounds that what he was writing about now was 1,000 years beforehand and hadn't come to happen. And that basically carried Greg in through the 90s. And then during that period, there was no professional publishing vehicle for Glorantha. And so Greg could kind of write whatever he wanted to write, but there also was no ability to really get any sort of larger publication for it because there wasn't a RuneQuest and Hero Wars HeroQuest hadn't been created. Then there's the Hero Wars HeroQuest material, and that opened the floodgates, but Greg was actually not very involved in much of that. So you had all of these people writing stuff and talking about it, but a lot of the time Greg might have seen it and said, hey, this is, yeah, cool. And that was about the extent of his review on it. And then we get into the RuneQuest, the new RuneQuest period, where it's okay, I have 40 years of material. How do we fit that material into a cohesive whole? And a lot of it, especially from the Hero Wars HeroQuest material, a lot of it we didn't fit in with this. And so there's lots of elements that we've either thrown away or de-emphasized. And meanwhile, there's lots of earlier publications that were really pulling up towards the fore. One of the most important being the materials that Greg put together for White Bear, Red Moon, and Nomad Gods. So I don't know, that was very long-winded. I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think it does, but I'll just dive a tiny bit deeper because I'm so interested, and I think so many people would be interested in. Can you give us just like a fly on the wall moment of what some of that decision-making process would have been like when you were trying to figure out how something would fit and how something wouldn't? How do you approach that from a creative writing, from a world building, from a game editor perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the one that always pops to mind is one of the ones that was always most contentious amongst the Glorantha fan community. And that was, what is Elmal, the Orlanthi sun god of the first age, and what is Yaumalio, a Orlanthi sun god of the third age? And this became particularly contentious because in Greg's first age material, the Orlanthi had a sun god that they called Elmal. And so in these early stories setting, early in the settings history, but not early from Greg's writing, the Orlanthi worship this sun god called Elmal, who they basically viewed as Orlanth's right-hand man. And he was the one that when Orlanth went on his hero quest to the edge of the world and into hell, called the Lightbringer's Quest, he set up the sun god to be the last light and look after all the people of the world while he was gone. Meanwhile, at the same time, we know from all the classic RuneQuest material that there's this other sun god called Yaumalio, which is known by the Orlanthi people. And Yaumalio has these big sun domes, and there's a big sun dome in Prax, which we all know from the 1990s RuneQuest 3 book called Sun County. But it's also the original one. And why reason I call it the original one is the first one Greg ever put into a story is there in Dragon Pass, and it's called Sundome County. They are on White Bear, Red Moon, and Dragon Pass. And in White Bear, Red Moon, or Dragon Pass, the Sundome is a quasi-autonomous source of mercenaries that theoretically could fight for either side in the big hero wars between Sartar and the Lunar Empire. So we have, and during the hero wars period, the preference was, well, let's get rid of Yaumalio, de-emphasize it completely, call it a foreign god, and we'll Elmal is new and sexy. Let's raise Elmal up into the fore. And when I started working on RuneQuest, I realized that just doesn't really work with the setting. If I go along with that, all sorts of other things don't line up. And I have to, very early on, I have to make a decision. What is Yaumalio and what is Elmal? And what I ended up going with is what I actually think Greg initially intended, which was Elmal was the Dawn Age sun god cult. And when the Orlanthi came into contact with real sun worshippers, the Elmal cult more or less began to collapse under the richness and greater depth of the sun worship in Peloria. And the Yaumalio cult was the synthesis that came out of this. So it's kind of it's not an ally of Orlanth, but it's not an enemy of Orlanth. It's a frenemy. And but I sat there and I wrote down notes. I tried to think through the history. I tried to think through, how does this actually do either of these make logical sense? What elements of the setting will have to change if I pick one or the other, which is going to cause the most disruption overall to the setting? And that's just, that's probably the most extreme example that I've had to do, but it's certainly one that I think probably most fans are happy with it. Yamali was always a popular cult, but there's some fans like, what? You just got rid of my favorite sun god cult. And that's part of the job of trying to reconcile 40 plus years of material and turn it into something that we can all game with and we can all explore, and we don't have to rely on trying to collect obscure and esoteric unpublished sources.
So on that note, changes going through, sorcery has evolved a lot over time. Can you give us some insight into the thought process around those changes?
Yeah, Greg always imagined sorcery as a humanist, rationalist exercise. So you go back to his earliest sorcerers and or earliest stories, and the sorcerers were people that understood how magic fit together. How the gods fit together in the cosmos so that we can manipulate it to the benefit of humanity. And when RuneQuest 3 came out, Greg and Sandy, and I think Sandy Peterson had the lion's share of writing on that. Maybe it was Steve Perrin as well. They came up with a magic system that really didn't do any of that. It was basically a way for you to create really powerful magical effects, but it didn't serve that world building, story building purposes. And when we were working on RuneQuest, the new RuneQuest, one of the things Greg asked is, please get rid of the RQ3 sorcery. Greg hated it, he gave some design specs for it. He thought it should really be about how do we manipulate the runes and the archetypes of Glorantha in order to generate magical effects. How it should be. He imagined it was something more of an ivory tower system. And by that, I mean something that you would imagine, your sorcerers going off into an ivory tower and spending the next 10 years working out a spell. And that spell is really powerful, but for gaming purposes, it's, well, that's great. You guys have, we've got some trolls. Then the sorcerer says, wait, I've got a brilliant idea. Let me go to the university. And I'm going to spend the next 5 years researching a really cool spell to screw with the trolls. It'll take another 5 years to cast once I figure it out, but it'll be awesome. And of course, all the other players go, yeah, but that's 10 years in the future. I mean, what are we going to do now? And so we created this system out of this. And there was some the idea was to have sorcerers put together runes, and then we added on to techniques, because Greg was always fond of the idea that there are the substance, the powers and forms and conditions that you're manipulating, and the techniques of manipulation itself. And so we combined that into a system and play tested it and worked it out, and very happy with it. But it's a radical change. But it was a radical change intended to have the magic system actually reinforce and reflect what was in Greg's stories and his conception of the setting.
So I suppose my final question is, we've talked about waves of creation and how approaches to material has shifted. I want to steer back to talking about creating new material and writing new stuff that isn't necessarily, well, I mean, everything inherits from what came before it, but new content. And I'd love to hear how things have changed just in the last 2 or 3 or 5 years. You know, in really recent time, I guess. Well, I guess the big point would be post Greg's passing. What is different about how you have to approach creating new content?
Well, first thing is I finally understand hero questing, and I understand how we can do it in RuneQuest, and also how it works in a game setting. And that was something that Greg understood how hero questing works from a pure creative process. So how do I put it into a story? What is it? How do I make that work when I'm writing a story? Now, that's a very different exercise than how do I introduce hero questing in a game with 4 or 5 players and a game master who's not Greg Stafford, and make it work. And I now, as a byproduct of writing the Cults book, I've got a really good feel for how all of that works together. And so suddenly a lot of other stories that had been, pretty much, well, just notes, now can be fleshed out and make sense and can be turned into gameable content. And that's really a breakthrough in the last 2 years. So if you look, the first part of that is the Cults book. The rules themselves will be in the Game Master's book, but the material in the RuneQuest campaign or the starter campaign, that's all over it. All the material that I've been working on. There's always a question of, okay, what's going on in the other side of this? What's the mythic archetype underlaying what's going on? And that's not something that was in any of the design scopes 3, 4, 5 years ago, because we didn't have a good model for how to even think about that. And so that's really changed things. Another really big development is that now that we have a really cohesive story about Dragon Pass and Prax and the Holy Country, is there's all the new material that I'm focusing on is about how these areas and how these people are going to change in a very short period, and introduce this as a dynamic and changing setting.